Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, sisters, friends, and the foes out there. And welcome to another episode of the Blood Brothers podcast with your host, Diddy Hussein. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to remind all the avid podcast listeners that you can find this episode and all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. And if you're tuning in via YouTube, don't be cheeky. Remember to click subscribe. Today's guest has flown in from Cork in the Republic of Ireland. I never actually read out verbatim bios from anyone's website, but I'm going to do it for today's guest because I find it quite funny and I'm going to try do justice to it. Tadhg Hickey. Hello. Is it Tadhg you're looking for?
Nice.
I'm a so-called comedian, actor, writer, musician, voiceover artist, political animal, ferret, alcoholic, and general morale booster around Cork. My exes include the original Pippa in Home and Away. That might be a bit old school for some of our viewers. And Kathleen Ni Houlihan. How do you pronounce that?
Houlihan, perfect.
Houlihan.
Yeah, your Irish pronunciations are top end, man.
Tadhg, welcome to the Blood Brothers podcast.
Pleasure.
Good to have
An
you.
absolute pleasure.
How was your travel today?
Yeah, it was pretty good. I was up nice and early. Any time that I'm away from home means that I don't have responsibility to look after an 11-month-old child. As much as I adore her, little breaks away, you know, you can't complain. So,
Were you kind of relieved when I sent you a voice line? You were here with my kids in the background as well.
well, that's it. We were just talking about that. Yeah, like phone calls at the moment are not an option because she's very interested in eating my phone. So audio notes work very well.
My dad's a big fan.
You're saying?
Yeah, he's a big fan. And I told him I was having you on and he always sends me your sketches and your videos. The last 7 months or 8 months, I think your content has become more amplified and more viral than before. Because I was checking out your Twitter timeline. You were talking about Palestine way before October the 7th. So it's not something that you've grifted on, which many people have actually, right? But your content has certainly been more amplified in the last 7 to 8 months. Have you noticed that yourself?
Absolutely. And a quick point on the grifting. I always think it's funny, even people who are accused of it, I always think like grifting to support Palestine, a notoriously bad idea for your career.
Yeah.
Like you could have chosen something a little bit more opportunistic, like namely Zionism. But oh yeah, of course, look, I mean, the world changed on October 7th, like not just my world, and obviously the priority being Palestinians' world and the cause and the amount of people who've died or have been murdered, I should say, is front and centre in everyone's thoughts. But in terms of what it can possibly mean for Palestinian justice and statehood going forward, I think the world has changed. But yeah, my own experience is I was doing political comedy anyway. I've got a kind of an anti-colonial slant on most things. I had done lots of sketches about Palestine, and actually I just shared an old sketch at the start of the so-called war, and it went kind of viral again. And you know, I spoke to my Palestinian friends in Cork and said, because for the first week I actually didn't do anything. I shared that original sketch that kind of details the scenario of somebody calling to your house and saying, actually, I own this house because it says it in this
Was that from
book.
2021?
Yeah. I repurposed it and put it out. And I was unsure about doing comedy because from my, and I'm not saying I'm an expert, but from my understanding of that so-called conflict, I knew after October 7th, this is going to be absolute hell is going to be unleashed on these people, that some of whom are my friends at this point. But time and again, Palestinians would say, no, do your comedy. This is, you need to get in here, like, satire is going to play a very important role. So once I was given the go-ahead from them, I just started making sketches on the topic. And yeah, obviously the following has blown up, but it's more to do with me trying to come up with allyship in something that I feel like I'm good at. And it's been the most meaningful period of my career. It's a weird thing to say in the middle of a genocide, but I feel useful. And there's people in my corner kind of saying, keep going. And it's a lovely feeling. It's kind of not about me, which is great, you know, because like typical Western mentality is self-obsession by default. Mm-hmm. And I haven't had that much of an opportunity to think about myself in the last few months. That's good for me.
Let's understand Tadhg before the comedy, the acting, the voiceover, the struggles with alcohol. Where was your hometown? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Cork, in Ireland. It's right down the south. Kind of a working class background. My dad would have been a Labour voter, our Labour, which would have been reasonably good for a long period in Ireland. Leftist, working class values. I had a really happy childhood, to be fair. Like, but I suppose from a young age, I just thought that I was kind of, and like, it's funny looking at it through the prism of what's going on in the world now. Are we just preconditioned in the West to be more self-obsessed? I don't know. I really don't know. But
were your parents religious? Or grandparents?
Yeah, they were actually. Yeah, both my parents were religious. Yeah, my dad was definitely. I was thinking about it a lot lately. He had a really strong faith. He was kind of very quiet. You wouldn't get to know exactly what was going on in his head, but he had a real faith. And I used to go to mass with him, and he had fidelity to, you know, the system of the mass. He'd be getting down on his knees, and he was doing it passionately. Like, yeah. But then he'd kind of put it away. You know, it wasn't like, from certainly my Muslim friends, I really get the idea that religion is such a big part of your life all the time, like every day. Constant, yeah. You wear it on your sleeve. It seems Catholicism to me as a kid was quite different. It was like we go to mass and we do all the stuff that we do at mass, and then we kind of put it away. Compartmentalized a little bit, yeah. And your values, I mean, I think my dad took some of his values from Catholicism, but others were just his kind of humanity, I think. As a person, it didn't seem like he was pulling from religion. He just was a good guy. He was honest. He was hardworking. And if you stepped out of line, you knew about it. Like, I definitely had a healthy fear of him. Yeah, oh, totally, yeah.
How many siblings? Do you have siblings?
Yeah. So I had four siblings, and I was the youngest by a mile. So my dad was like a very capable man with his hands in his younger years. So by the time I came along, he'd really mellowed, you know.
Oh, you got the soft dad.
Oh, I got the soft dad. He's totally chilled out. So my older brothers would look at, like, there's one incident where, like, I was short of a pair of socks. I think I was like probably 12 or something, and I was going through my dad's socks, and I was just throwing them on the ground going, rubbish, 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 don't like the colour, don't like the colour. And he jumped up off the chair, and he said something like, well, if they're not good enough for you, so just forget about it. And he scooped them all up. And the way he did it, I know that sounds minor now, but he did it like with such an imposing physicality. I was like, this guy's nuts. Yeah. But I obviously haven't seen it, you know. And my brothers would be like, the shit that I'd get away with him, it just blew their mind. But I was like, you know, what we call in Catholic Ireland a surprise, you know, much younger, and my dad had just mellowed, and I got away with murder. And that was kind of a feature of my life, and thinking that I was somehow exceptional, you know, I was going to get away with all these things, like that I didn't have to do what my brothers had to do.
In that regard, how was school years then? Because if they didn't get away with much from a very strict dad, how were your school years, teens?
They were good because my family, my older brothers would be working men. They worked in construction, and my dad was also like doing physical work. So I was the first person, my sister joined me afterwards, but I was the first person in the family to go to university. So I kind of felt early on whatever, and it wasn't because I was in any way special. I was just so much younger than them that, like, life had moved on in Ireland, and then more people were going to university, but they definitely treated me like I'm doing quite well in school, and they were very proud of me. You know, my dad sadly passed away when I was in Leaving Cert, but I was already doing, yeah, thank you. I was already doing really well in school, and it was like my path was ahead of me, that I was going to go to college and all that kind of stuff. So I felt like I could kind of coast a little bit because I'm the golden boy. Yeah. Like, it's classic youngest kid thing, you know. And that coasting was problematic for me. I feel like now in later life that I can't really coast at all. I have to be moving forward. I have to be kind of working on myself, or I just go backwards. But I didn't know that at 18 or 19. So coasting for me meant drinking, taking drugs, and pursuing women with no thought at all of their feelings, or, you know, just really self-centered. And I'd like to not offer an excuse, but an explanation was that there was some trauma. I felt like I'd been given a hard hand. There was some stuff going on at home that wasn't great. As I say, my dad died when I was 18. And I felt like I'd been given I'd been dealt a difficult hand in life. So it was okay for me to go and do whatever I wanted and treat people with disrespect.
Did you ever wonder to yourself, and obviously I don't know at all what you're referring to, did you ever wonder to yourself, when you have kind of self-reflective moments, that hard hand that was dealt to you, that perhaps you were over amplifying it, or you were being entitled, or it was something genuine?
Of course. Oh no, of course. Like, it was something genuine, but I also was over amplifying it, you know. I mean, one of the things that I still have to keep an eye on even today is self-obsession. Like, the more time I'm thinking about myself, the worse I feel. That's a yardstick that is true from childhood to today. And yeah, there was stuff went on at home, but it wasn't the worst, you know. Like, I always think there's where I felt I grew up, you know, it wasn't amazing. I didn't have everything in school. We weren't rich, but compared to people living in the global south right now, we were like extremely wealthy, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
definitely.
It's all relative. And yeah, so that feeling that you were hard done by created a perfect kind of atmosphere for me to go into life going, I'm going to do whatever I want now. And very early on, I kind of lost my father's teaching, which was, you work hard, nobody owes you anything, and you treat people, particularly women actually, with respect and dignity, and he just seemed to have it all figured out. You know, I was absolutely obsessed with him, like, and I'm sure that's that's coming across. So I think when he died at 18, I felt like my world kind of fell apart then, because my kind of guide, the thing and the person that I looked up to was gone. So I felt like, now that he's left the stage, I'm going to go center stage, get my limelight, and do whatever I want.
You know, you mentioned earlier about there was a period where, you know, women drink drugs. How wild was it?
Yeah, it was pretty wild. I would refer people to my book. I've written a book on the topic. It's called A Portrait of the Piss Artist as a Young Man.
Okay.
And it was wild in terms of substances. I suppose it was pretty wild. I mean, there was a period in Edinburgh when I first went to Edinburgh. I was supposed to be doing a show, and I just spent most of the Edinburgh Fringe that time drinking and losing my shoes and smoking crack in some crack den in Glasgow. But it was all coming from this place of running away from myself, you know, running away from responsibility. And yeah, I mean, in terms of substances and in terms of like alcohol was definitely my main thing. So like, I was taking drugs to keep myself awake. And in terms of the drinking, I was a binge drinker, which I think was more difficult for my family than somebody who was chronically drinking. That's my own experience anyway, and I don't think alcoholism is easy under any circumstances. But I used to have this mentality of, I'll be a good boy for a certain period, so I'll not be drinking. And I had a daughter when I was very young. I didn't have her. My ex-partner had her, just to clarify.
She's 20 right now.
She's 20 now, yeah, and she's
You
amazing.
wouldn't think it. You look like a young man.
Oh, thanks, man. I love that. My Muslim friends, they just lift me up, like,
They
and
just
all I
do.
gotta do is revert.
Yeah,
All
that's
I
it.
gotta do is
'Cause if you
revert
don't,
to
you're going to
Islam.
fall straight back down.
And I know I've got this limited window to do it in as well, you know.
Inshallah.
So I had a daughter when I was quite young, and so all that kind of stuff was kind of going on. And as I say, I had this good boy mentality where I was looking after my daughter, I was going to work, and I was golden boy, to go back to golden boy. So I was saying hello to the neighbours, and I was pushing my buggy, and they were like, oh my God, he's such a great dad. And then the need, I think, possibly need, or certainly want to go and get smashed would come back. And then I'd go missing for literally 2, 3, 4 days at a time. My phone would be off. Nobody would know where I was. I wasn't a very expansive drunk. I would often be around the city. But in a sense, that was even worse, because I would be a yardstick from coming home and facing my responsibilities, but my phone would be off and the door would be closed in whatever house or...
Who would be on
part
your
of
case
it.
the most?
My mom...
When you used to
I
go
don't think I've
AWOL?
ever called her mom before. I usually call her ma'am. She's no longer with us either, sadly. But
Sorry to hear that as well.
but she she was a worry mouse, so I probably had a lot of anxiety, and she was very anxious, and she was, as I say, I was a golden boy, and she was so worried when I was out. And I kind of, I mean, this is the cruel thing about alcoholism and addiction, I think, is that, like, I knew I was breaking this woman's heart. I knew I was breaking my ex-partner's heart, and that I should have been there for my daughter. And I know people will listen to this and think that it's shameful, you know, to not be there for, and I think it's shameful. I went through an awful lot of shame, but addiction really is a mental illness, you know, like I was mentally unwell at the time, certainly, because when I stopped drinking, I've always been there for my daughter, and I don't let people down in that regard. But yeah, it would be mostly my mum and my ex-partner. So if you could wake up to, I don't know, like 100 missed calls and text messages, and the fear of that then, you know, because you might go out drinking kind of going, don't mind them all. I'm the man. I'm going to do what I want. But actually, that was to cover over fear and insecurity, and the feeling that you'd let them down. Again, when you'd look at your phone, was just you'd want to be anywhere else in the world. Like, you'd feel like this big. It even gives me a shiver up my spine to think of those days, you know, to wake up and think, oh, actually, I'm a piece of shit.
How long did it last for? On and off? Or was it on and off?
It was on and off because I was a binge drinker the whole time. So, like, I could be off it at times for months, and then I'd come back in and go for 2 or 3 days, or be off it, and then every weekend for a while. And, oh, man. So it was from I started drinking when I was 16, and I finished up in 2015. So, like, I was 33 at the time, so it was like 32, 33. So
when was the last time you drank alcohol?
The last time I drank alcohol was May the 9th, 2015, sitting on the side of the road in London. Wow. Actually, I was in London, and I'd lost my keys and my wallet. I'd no means of getting home. I think I'd possibly lost my phone as well. And I just collected enough change from the girl that I was seeing at the time, and I bought myself a can of Stella. And I was sitting on the side of the road, and I could just feel my whole world crashing in my head. I just knew it was over. Like, whatever was up with me, alcohol was no longer fixing it. And the whole thing just came crashing in on top of me. Like, I'd probably describe it as, without being insulting to people who've gone through serious mental illness, it felt like a nervous breakdown to me at the time, you know. And it felt really like a spiritual experience as well, because it felt like whatever it is you're doing up until this point, because I'd always had a connection to God, always. And I would have probably used the word God. You know, I would have been happy to use the term God. It mightn't have been the God of the religion that I grew up with, Catholicism, but a faith and a spirituality was always there. And from that moment on, I threw myself into a recovery from addiction, but it was completely through the prism of spirituality. It had to have a power greater than myself, or I was dead, and I was very clear about that.
What would your advice be to family members, spouses, parents who are struggling with immediate family members within the house that are struggling with alcohol?
Like, it's a heartbreaking thing to say, but you can't fix them. You
can't?
No, you can't. You can't, like, if you had a drink problem and I'm your buddy, I can't fix you. Like, I can be there for you.
What if I'm your dad?
Your every instinct in your body, I know, is going to want to fix them, but it will actually be a power greater than themselves that'll do it, and they'll have to meet you halfway. Like, people regularly these days say to me, you know, could you talk to my brother? Could you talk to my son? And unless they have an interest in stopping drinking, it really is pointless. You have to allow somebody to get to that point where it gets so bad that they want to change. And then there's an opportunity to speak to them. But ultimately, it has to come from themselves. That's been my experience anyway. And don't get me wrong, I know when somebody's going through something like that and you care about them, every sinew in your being is wanting to reach out and shake them, but actually that can often push them away and make the recovery process delayed. So just be there for them, kind of almost quietly in the background. And sometimes you got to have tough love as well. That's what I would say. Like, I had a lot of tough love in my life. You know, sometimes if somebody keeps breaking your heart and they're stealing money from you and they're completely out of control, the best thing you can do actually is to say, I'm going to let you go with love for the time being. And when you get yourself together, you know, I'll be there for you, but I can't have you under my own house. And that, I mean, people in recovery programs will tell you that. It sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes when you take away the security blanket, people like me go, okay, I don't want to die. I'm really on my own now. I'm going to be homeless. So I need to get my shit together.
Do you think those things that you just described is also similar to people struggling with hard drugs like crack and heroin?
Completely. Absolutely. The only difference being, I think, as I say, I was a binge drinker, so I don't identify with the kind of gnawing need to use again, right? So that's why I would be very reluctant to I mean, I don't speak at drug, you know, I wouldn't speak to I'd speak to fellow addicts with alcohol, but not so much with drugs, because I wouldn't really fully know what I'm talking about. But the root, all addiction is the same. And it's usually covering over some sort of childhood trauma. And that's a relatively new concept, talking about all this stuff, you know, the idea that Now trauma's become a bit of a buzzword, like, you know,
and overused at
it
times.
is overused. And even people who, like, I spent time with Daniel Mate recently, who's Gabor Mate's son, and he was like, he said, I'm sick of the word trauma. These guys are writing books about trauma, you know. So, but it's like that thing in the mass media when a term that actually has huge relevance and does have meaning is overused, and then it ceases to have any meaning anymore. It becomes kind of hyper real, you know. I think that's happened with trauma, but the fact of the matter is, most people struggling with addiction have gone through something in their lives that's very significant and they haven't dealt with it, if that's a better way to look at it maybe. And I was definitely one of those. So, and I think most people in addiction have that. It just helps the wider world to understand that. I mean, you've met me now today, right? Do you get a sense that I'm a horrible person?
No, of course not.
But when I was drinking, I behaved in a way that you definitely would have thought that. So I think that's a good illustration that it's a moral. I'm not mad about the moral thing because that makes you feel like you're just a waste of space. I do feel comfortable calling it a mental illness. And then you get treatment for your mental illness, which often involves a spiritual path. And then you're no longer this completely selfish person. So, I mean, when I was drinking, I wondered, I'm like, am I evil? Is there something wrong with me? Because I feel like I love this child. I feel like I love my family. I enjoy my work. I don't want to be letting people down, and yet I keep doing it, you know. So it's like the definition of insanity, continuing to do the same things, expecting different results. So just that element of compassion, I think, is
Did you ever try controlling your addiction?
Of course.
Is there ever a phase where you kind of like you understand that it's an addiction, you try kind of formalizing it to make it less bad?
Of course.
By scheduling when you're going to have those binges and relapses. Have you ever done that?
100%. In fact, that's your great obsession, you know. So to go back to my dad drank alcohol, but he was always fully functional for his family. He looked after his family. That's a big thing. That where I started to feel really shameful was I wasn't going to work, or was, in my case, early on college. I was missing things that I was supposed to be doing, but most importantly, I wasn't looking after my family. And that was the metric that I always looked to, that my dad always did.
Did you try being a functional alcoholic?
I tried my best, but I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. But to answer your question, of course, like I was 18 doing my leaving cert in Ireland, which is whatever the equivalent here is in Britain. State exams, like, or whatever, right? A-levels, exactly. Yep. And I stopped drinking for the months leading into my A-levels. Because I knew that if I drank, I wouldn't be able to study. So I was already managing my drinking at 18. So I was completely aware that I had a problem. So like for literally the next 13 or 14 years, however long it was, I was trying to find ways to moderate. If I just drink this, don't drink whiskey, just drink pints, just drink on a Saturday, don't drink in the morning. Like I tried it all, and you'd get on okay for a while, and then you would inevitably fall back into, because I feel like there was a hole inside of myself, and for a long time, alcohol was filling that hole. So when you feel like that hole is gnawing and empty again, you just got to pick up again, and you can't control how much you're going to pour in the hole.
What's filled that void now?
Spirituality. And I know that sounds vague, and I suppose coming from a Muslim background, you're just like, look, will you just revert? Enough of this spirituality stuff. But it is faith in a power greater than myself. I'm happy to call that God.
Would that God be one?
Have
you ever wondered those questions?
Of course. I have found the God of my own understanding, which I don't think is going to be that much against the teachings of Islam, but I feel like God is inside myself. Rather than, I don't know, is that totally against Islam?
Kafir! Kuffar! Yeah, it's a bit different. Very different.
I feel like God...
But it's cool, I'm not asking you, you tell me.
Of course, yeah. I mean, this is just me, like my hang-ups with Catholicism was something that I kind of needed to get away from.
What were those hang-ups?
It felt like it was a religion, as I grew up, that had a lot of optics of being holy. Mm-hmm. You know, so some, not all, some of the holy people in my life would be serving at Mass. They would be ascetic in the way that they would live their lives on paper in terms of the optics. But then actually they could be extremely harsh, really judgmental, really angry. Like a lot of the holiest people that I remember from childhood were really angry, mental, repressed people. That's just my experience. And it felt like Catholicism, a lot of it was about pointing the finger at other people and being judgmental, marginalising people. And then, of course, the absolute brutality of the church in Ireland, particularly, and child sex abuse scandals. And friends of mine have gone through experiences where whatever about the perpetrators, like that it was actually covered up by the hierarchy of the church. All this kind of stuff swirling around your head when you're a messed up lad in his 20s looking for a spiritual path.
So with all with all that happening, your framing, your posturing, your observation, exposure and experience of Catholicism, was it problematic to then kind of revert back to a understanding or acknowledgement of God or a greater being?
Yes, I had to find a new God for me. And that was literally almost like a geographic thing of taking him away from up here as this distant, bearded man in a cloud, which was kind of the loose understanding or Jesus.
That's certainly the Western Christian understanding.
Yes, yeah.
Or depiction, rather.
Yeah. And I had to take him from up there and put him in here. So I started doing a type of meditation that felt like transcendental meditation, that felt like the connection I was having was inside myself. So it just made more sense to me that God or spirituality was inside, not just me. Like, I'm not saying I'm God's representative on earth, but inside all of us, you know, and that there is God in all of us. And like, there's a sentence in the recovery, one of the recovery books, shall we say, and I won't be specific because we don't be specific, and the sentence says, you know, you help others and God helps you. And that made a whole lot of sense to me. So to go back to when you said, what did you do? You know, I got spirituality, but that meant, crucially, I looked at my own stuff. I took responsibility for it. I stopped painting myself as a victim and over-amplifying the bad hand that I was dealt, to go back to that. And most importantly, I started helping other people. You know, so if it's other alcoholics, great. And this extends into the activism and some of the stuff that I did later in life. And to go back to the thought of the less I'm thinking about me, the more I'm thinking about others. Like, if you're helping other people, you know, if you're not harming other people, and you're trying to live a good life and you've taken responsibility for your stuff, I don't care what religion you are, then I want to be around that person. But for me, some of the people that I remember from my childhood religion, they didn't have any of that stuff. They were messed up. They hadn't looked at themselves, and they were using religion in the way that I was using alcohol.
Kind of like, I mean, we kind of jumped it because we were going to talk about religion later on, but I guess we're talking about it now. You know, just on kind of like, I don't want a conversion on screen of Tadhg, right?
Try it.
But yeah, no, but look, just see, the God of Islam, Allah, is one. He's neither within his creation or any directional space. He's beyond the heavens and the earth. And he's put in within every human being three innate dispositions. The survival instinct. So our need to survive. We're hungry, we need to eat. We're thirsty, we drink. We're hot, we take our clothes off. We're cold, we put clothes on, and so forth. The procreation instinct, to mate, to have intimacy, to have children. And the reverence instinct, and that is to always believe or look to something greater than yourself. Every human has that. Would you agree?
Absolutely, yeah.
We all have the survival instinct.
Yeah.
We all have the procreation instinct.
Yeah.
And we all have the reverence instinct. Whether you want to say God, self-worship, superstars, celebrities, ideologies, wherever it may be. God has instilled that amongst all human beings. And the God of Islam is one, and he has do's and don'ts, but he certainly isn't a bearded figure in the clouds. And I would invite you to look into it more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how's your DMs been? Because your Muslim audience, your Muslim fan base must have grown significantly in the last 7 to 8 months. How's your DMs been, brother Tadhg?
My DMs are like Piccadilly Circus with Muslims asking me to revert. No, I will say though, I have Muslim friends in Ireland, and being around them, and not just Palestinians, but certainly Palestinians, being around them and seeing the role that your faith has played in their resilience and ability to get their heads around and survive something that is literally unthinkable, it's unconscionable, has blown my mind, and it certainly has made me more attracted to understand whether I would revert or not. And revert is the correct term.
Revert is actually,
yeah.
revert is a more popular term that's used amongst those within Muslim apologetics, yes. because the reason why we say revert is because there is a position and understanding that every human being was born on the disposition of monotheism.
Yes.
So you're actually just reverting back to what God initially made you as. That's what we say, revert.
Yes.
But then lots of white reverts these days don't like that. They're like, well, hold on. When we were babies, we weren't Muslims in the conventional sense, so we're converts. But it's semantics.
The whites have to change it again.
Yes,
like,
no.
my God.
So look, just before we move on, because I want to kind of wrap this up, alcohol is something which is clearly prohibited in Islam. There are Muslims who have problems with alcohol. There are Muslims who drink. But it's not something which is popularized, normalized, socially accepted, whether it be in the Muslim world or in Muslim communities. In the Muslim majority world, you'd find probably Turkey is the one that has the most kind of liberal approach to Turkish people drinking openly. Other than that, it's done either secretly, illegally, or in tourist quarters in the Muslim world. But Muslims have problems with alcohol. The very fact that there is a 14th century tradition and scholarship of works addressing the struggles with alcohol. We find in the Christian world or the Western world or wherever you want to coin it or term it, you know, drinking is a massive part of the culture. It is very much part of the social fabric. You have it with a meal. You have it when someone dies. You have it when you celebrate. You have it when you're happy. You have it when you're sad. You have it when you're just chilling. You have it when you're jolly. You have it in your funerals. You have it in your weddings. What this reliance on alcohol, because you mentioned that it's to kind of gloss over and glue over the kind of trauma, anxiety, fears, problems perhaps from the past, unresolved. How common do you think alcohol is for the Westerners or white Westerners? In fact, I don't even know what the term is. For those who alcohol is a big part of their life, normally, socially, how much of it do you think is linked to perhaps just taking an edge off life when you got a lot of crap to deal with from past and present?
Yeah, it's a huge part of it. I mean, I'll use Ireland as an example, and I'm quite familiar with Scotland as well, and it's similar there. I'm sure it's the same in England. I'm not as familiar with the continent, but
Irish and Scots, let's go
Irish and Scots. I feel like
whiskey and Guinness, because it's a massive thing.
And I mean, the Irish are kind of Scots anyway, realistically. I think a big part of it, so, I mean, I'm an alcoholic, but talking to my friends who are not alcoholics at all, the common thread with drinking, particularly when you're young, is to mask social anxiety. So you're really nervous about, like, speaking to a girl for the first time. You're nervous about hanging out with your friends. You know, even when I was, for a long time in my drinking, the thought of, like, I would be speaking to you now, and I'd be thinking to myself, what does he do with his male friends? So if none of you guys drink, and I'm not exceptional here now, the Irish mentality would be like, what do those guys do for fun? You know, we would find it very hard to, what do you do, like? What do you hang out, you know? And how could you possibly have a kind of a fulsome, open conversation? Because, again, in Ireland, we use alcohol to be able to facilitate actual conversations. Because if we're not drunk, we're so repressed as a people. And again, I think Catholicism has played a big part in that. We're so repressed that we would just function in kind of small talk. You'd never actually talk about your feelings, or, God forbid, you talk about grief or loss or any of your emotions.
Why was that the case? Why would it be contained? Why do you need alcohol to talk about grief and hardship and struggle?
I mean, I don't want to be blaming the Brits too early in this podcast, but I feel like there's a post-colonial hangover, to, if you pardon the pun. I mean, the famine, the so-called famine in Ireland, is a deeply traumatic event that's in our bones. It's in our DNA. And I think, like, our drinking is a response to that and general colonial issues. Obviously in the north, being like colonial issues and British imperialism is a thing in the north right now. It's a little bit different in the south, but I think British colonialism and certainly the Catholic Church created this kind of hotbed of repression and pain and trauma, and then alcohol became the quick fix for everything. But certainly I grew up in a world where most of the time adults didn't seem to be smiling, they didn't seem to be talking openly, and then you go into a pub and there's a lad opening his heart about some woman who left him 20 years ago, like, you know, so it's used as therapy, I think, a lot in Ireland. Mask social anxiety, therapy for trauma, and you feel like you can't, like, the big thing I hear from young people when they stop drinking is, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do with my life? Now, that seems ridiculous to me now. I'm sure it seems ridiculous to you. But when I was drinking, I was the same. I was like...
Was gym, sports, movies, other social activities?
Well, sports...
driving cars?
Sports is all drinking. So the GAA or amateur soccer in Ireland... is like you play your game, but you're going out to the pub then for the day.
Okay, so it's linked to the sports.
It's linked to the sports, yeah.
The social aspect of the sports.
The cinema, when I was drinking in my 20s, I was always drunk at the cinema.
Driving cars?
Driving cars has become a social faux pas under the influence of alcohol in the last 10 or 15 years.
Motorbike, scooters.
When I was growing up, I don't think I ever got into the car with an adult who wasn't drunk. Like, people used to drive home country roads drunk.
Boxing, self-defense.
You're more likely to be able to express your anger when you're drunk as well. That's actually a really pertinent point. Yeah, like, people be fighting. So, like, an Irish pub would have, like, people telling each other about their feelings, singing songs, like, and then at the end of the night, probably sometimes beating the head off each other.
Ty, can I ask you something?
Yeah.
It's random, but it just came to my mind. Please forgive me for my political incorrectness if it is the case. Are the Irish travellers your kinsmen ethnically?
They're a separate...
Are they
ethnicity?
So they're separate.
Yeah. They're a separate ethnicity.
They're not your conventional white Irish.
No, they have their own ethnicity. Yeah,
but they're not Romanis, are they?
No.
Because Romanis are kind of like originally from India,
Yes.
were expelled, then kind of end up in Europe and Romania and so forth. So
Yeah.
who are the Irish travellers?
I'm not an expert on that now, to be honest with you. Like,
what do you know? What do you know of the Irish travellers?
Like, I'll tell you one thing about them. They were traditionally the bogeyman in Ireland. So they're the group that we usually kick down at and we criminalise and we use as an excuse to come up with laws and marginalise them. There's a friend of mine, Tony Groves, who runs a great podcast called the Echo Chamber podcast. He's great for Irish politics if anyone's listening. But
Wicked.
He says that we created a new rung in place of the travellers, which is immigrants now. So, like, amongst the far right, I think those people would have been traditionally very tough on travellers. They're completely marginalised, and they're still very marginalised. They're fighting for any kind of rights in Irish society. That's still... Do you know what you get?
Could you tell an Irish traveller?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. You know, there's certain ways in which they will talk, or their culture that would be very clear very, very early on, and other times no.
Okay.
But they would traditionally have been the type of person that was to go back to what I was saying about the marginalisation, they're one of the only groups left in Ireland that the regular folk can insult and call derogatory terms and no one will bat an eyelid. You know, so we've got a lot of exceptionalism around travellers. We'd be looking after a lot of, even people on the left, groups in the left can sometimes do an awful lot of work to help marginalised groups and immigrants and LGBTQ+ and etc. But they forget travellers completely. They're out of sight, out of mind, because they literally are out of sight, out of mind, because they live in halting sites and whatnot. So, yeah.
How would an island without alcohol look like?
Oh my God.
Or restricted alcohol?
Oh man, I don't know. I mean, first of all, we'd all lose our minds in the short term because everyone's using it as an anaesthetic. You know, people are using it, as I say, for all sorts of reasons to deal with the trauma and the anxiety and all that kind of stuff. So we'd initially lose our minds, but then we'd probably heal collectively. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of people are drinking and they're having fun. They're probably masking social anxiety, but they're having fun. They don't get into problems. I'm literally just talking about the problem drinkers, but there are a lot of us. And the other interesting thing about Ireland is we've got a big understanding of alcohol. We know what it is to get drunk. We're marinated in alcohol, but we have little to no understanding of alcoholism. So we don't know how to treat it. If somebody is an alcoholic in Ireland, usually there's a real kind of almost like Catholic Church stuff again, a feeling of kind of, you know, moralising about them, get them out of society, get them fixed and get them brought back in again, rather than looking at the reasons as a society that we have become world famous for creating so many alcoholics. Like there has to be some part that society and the family plays.
So it's not a stereotype then. Brothers and sisters and friends, I see that you're enjoying the content. How come you've not clicked subscribe to the Five Pillars YouTube channel? And if you're watching via Rumble, how come you've not subscribed on our Rumble channel? If you like the content, you like the guests, you like what we're talking about, it's absolutely inexcusable and cheeky for you not to click subscribe. Thank you and Jazakallah khair.
No, it's not a stereotype. Like that we're brainless dopes and we're always going around drunk and fighting and stuff.
No, they're just the people that who are brave, courageous, but at the same time they love their drink.
I tell you what, man, it depends where the stereotype's coming from. So if you stereotyped us, I'd have no problem with that. If a British nationalist or an American stereotyped us, you know, context is key. Like, you know, you see like an SNL sketch where we're called paddies and it's like really base kind of idiotic perceptions and portrayals of Irish. That's insulting for some reason because it feels like they're looking down on us a little bit. But like if my Muslim friends and my Palestinian friends, like one thing that we've got in common is a dark sense of humour. So we take the mickey out of each other, no bother. Context is key for stereotypes, I think.
Right. Now, when did comedy, you know, the politicization, you come in contact and exposure to political issues, when did all that start happening?
It's funny, during lockdown,
your artistic output, when did all that start happening?
So I'd been doing comedy of like stand-up. I'd be doing there was a trio of us doing sketch comedy for years. It was always kind of surreal stuff. I did some stuff with Irish television and we had some success, but I always had this burning desire inside myself to do more political stuff and to do more provocative material. And the British Empire, which I've mentioned several times, was a bone of contention for me, shall we say. And I thought that satire would be a great way to kind of, you know, expose some of the hypocrisy and the empire nostalgia with the British state. So I started doing sketches in lockdown when I was locked in the house and it was just me and my buddy. I had to play all the characters. I had some wigs in the attic kind of thing. And one of the first sketches we did was a house share sketch where Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales and Loyalism were in a house together. And it got like 1.5 million views. And then suddenly I was like, okay, this fusion has happened in my mind where I'd always been reading history and I was always interested in politics and particularly colonialism and the effects of colonialism. And comedy over here, and somehow there was a relationship between the two of them that I'd never seen before. I was like, oh, I can do my history and politics in comedy. It's weird, you know, the way, again, to go back to the compartmentalizing, I thought comedy existed over here more in a surreal setting. But when I merged them because I had nothing else to do in lockdown and all my gigs had been cancelled, it got this large audience and I kind of thought, okay, this is actually what I want to be doing. So that was one of the first sketches. And then I followed it up with a sketch about the British Empire where India and Ireland were at a school reunion and they meet Britain, this guy who bullied them in school or whatever. And then suddenly I got all these Indian followers and some followers in Africa and I was like, okay, there's an appetite for this around the world. And a big thing for me that it has facilitated me doing is to get out of the mindset of to be a success either in comedy or in any walk of life, you have to be a big star in Britain and America. I'm not sure I'd like to be a big star anywhere, to be honest, but I would be very content making a career for myself in Egypt, in the Arab world, in certainly Palestine and Jordan and these places, because it's again part of this Western mentality that he's only well known in Turkey. Like, that's not a real country. That's just kind of...
It's a very real country.
That's Muslims. Like, you know, I think, as you obviously know, like, racism exists in all sorts of levels, and that's a real subtle one where you hear people, you know, say, oh, he's just a big star in this place. We don't really know him that well in England, so he's not a big deal. I'm very proud to say most of my followers these days are from the Arab world, and I absolutely love it.
When did you become first exposed to the Palestinian cause? Or did that just kind of come with you being an Irish or an anti-colonialist? Exactly,
yeah. So I know you've spoken to Sean Murray, and I'd be very much Sean's ilk, I suppose, of...
top lad.
Great man, yeah. Great guy. Yeah. And knows his stuff big time. And I would be an Irish Republican, even though I'm from the South. I would be a very passionate Irish Republican, which wouldn't be trendy, possibly in the South. The South feels like it's moved on a little bit from the Northern struggle, and it played a very bit part role in supporting the North anyway in their hour of need. I would argue, but I definitely look at politics, I suppose, through the prism of anti-colonialism and Irish republicanism in a foundational way. That's what introduced me.
So you believe in a united Ireland?
Of course, yeah, and I believe in a united Ireland these days through democratic means, obviously, and also being an inclusive space for people from a British unionist background. It's not like orange trumps green in the way green trumping orange in the way that orange trump green. It's none of that stuff. But that would be my worldview. And so when you have that worldview, the type of Irish republicanism that I was always attracted to was internationalist. You know, it was always big on Cuba and, you know, Palestine and South Africa and struggles around the world. We identified ourselves with an anti-colonial struggle that transcended race and religion. And there definitely is something about the Palestine kind of situation which just feels uncanny for Irish people across the political spectrum, but certainly for Irish Republicans. And I'm sure, as you saw in your time in the North, there's just a real passionate...
It's still very much there.
It's so, yeah. But even in terms of the support for Palestine, I mean, you'll see as many Palestine flags in the North as you will as tricolours.
Falls Road and all these different neighbourhoods, loads of Palestine flags.
Absolutely, yeah. And the connections between the two countries for me is one of the most... I don't think I've ever felt so proud to be Irish in the way that the Irish people, anyway, whatever about the political class, have kind of stood up and been counted in this, the gravest hour of need for Palestinians. Definitely makes me proud.
94% of Palestinians are Muslim, possibly more. I think in Gaza it's like 97. What's your thoughts on the faith of the Palestinians? Because faith has always played a central role in the Palestinian cause for Muslims. It's where Masjid al-Aqsa is, it's where the third holiest site is, it's a location, the Holy Land, where we believe all the prophets visited, prayed. Very special place for us, as it is for Christians and Jews. What's your thoughts and observations been of the faith of Palestinians in experiencing the ongoing genocide?
Like we touched on it earlier, there's a guy, Ahmed, he's a trainee neurosurgeon who spent his training period in a hospital in Gaza for, I think he got out after something like 2 or 3 months. So I did a podcast with him recently, and the man spent his training picking up body parts and not being sure whether the person coming in the door was going to be a member. He couldn't get in touch with his family. Like, they are doing work that I think Westerners, it's not possible for us to do that type of work. So what's the missing ingredient? God. And he said it, so I asked him, I said, you know, I mean, I was crying during the podcast because he said himself, the levels of trauma that he has gone through, he feels like there should be a new level for Palestine.
Absolutely.
You know, that it's like, and again, we actually don't have the vernacular.
A child picking up the body parts of her parents, a kid's brain spilled out, and that's the remaining of a young boy's family of 12.
Yeah.
The stories are horrific. Husbands losing their wives, parents losing their children, losing your entire family, extended family, because one building was flattened. The stories and the kind of actual visual reality of what's happening here. Picking up the spleens and the organs and the leftovers of your murdered family members is something which even the children are showing great faith-based resilience.
And that's the point. I don't know if it's possible for a group of people who are secular to be able to sustain themselves through a period like that. There are even Palestinian friends of mine in Cork who go to therapy in Ireland, and the therapist doesn't know what to do with them. The therapist can't, like, and actually in one case recently, the therapist said, look, I have no experience with torture. You know, one of my friends has been tortured. And he actually found that really consoling, that someone was able to say, I'm not qualified. We're not qualified in the West. And that again speaks to the kind of neo-colonial idea that we just don't know how to deal with people who've been through it feels like the West has created the causes and conditions for a lot of this stuff, and then is not qualified to be able to deal with the consequences, which is people in this deep, deep trauma. And to go back to Ahmed, he literally said, you know, I said, how do you make sense of it? Also, how do you get up every day and go to work? So how do you, as a young man, I think he's like in his 20s, get up and go to work, putting body parts into bags, and as importantly, or potentially more importantly, not having any knowledge of what your family's situation is. I mean, that for me is to be able to get up in that mindset and go to work. And he just said, it's my faith, and I have a faith that this is what I'm supposed to be doing, that there's a plan here that I'm not aware of. And it's incredible. I don't feel like if the shoe was on the other foot and the Zionists were going through something like this right now, even though they put their faith front and center for their political ideology. My brief experience of listening to them speak, I don't think they've got a kind of a faith that could possibly withstand something like this. It doesn't feel like it's a faith-based ideology at all. It's
Zionism,
political.
yeah.
Zionism, yeah, it's fascistic, it's political, and it's about hatred. I don't think it can sustain itself without hatred, and I don't think Palestinians can sustain themselves at the moment without love. And it's a love of God, but it's a love for each other as well. I tell you one thing, man, they are teaching me so much about what actually matters in life, and I say that for Irish people generally. Like the relationship is completely symbiotic. The Palestinians in Ireland at the moment are keeping Irish people going. It's extraordinary.
Alhamdulillah, you know, in the last 7 to 8 months, I mean, many Muslims have known this about the people of Palestine and Gaza especially, but there is a saying that verily it is the people of Gaza and Palestine that are alive and we are dead.
Yes.
And it is very much the case that they are people who have shown and proven their humanity. And in fact, they are a test for us to prove our humanity.
Absolutely.
And I think that would be so true to the case. And we've seen that in the last 7 to 8 months.
I mean, I've seen anecdotally an awful lot of people reverting to Islam because of
the resilience. Yeah.
I mean, you can see
happened.
the evidence. I mean, if faith can get you through this, it can get you through anything, you know. And like there's a friend of mine, Habib, who works in Is Cafe in Cork. Shout out, best cafe in Ireland, best restaurant in Ireland, I should say. You know, he's worrying about his family at the moment. He's from Gaza. He's trying to get them to come to Ireland. He's in the middle of kind of classic Irish bureaucracy at the moment. And when Is isn't around, he's running that cafe. Like, it's just another simple example of a personal story of people in Ireland are just absolutely in awe of these people who are getting up every day and going to work, fully functional members of society, doing great work, and have this like gnawing worry about their family members. And that's only part of it. He's also understandably devastated by the annihilation of his people back home. You know, I'm sure he wants to be there in many ways. Like, I've heard that time and time again from Palestinians that they would actually rather be in Gaza than here, but they can't get there. So yeah, they're just extraordinary people, and it's been one of the best experiences of my life to get to know them personally, to move my activism from an abstraction almost on the internet or learned from books into the personal. Then it gives a different, complete flavour to your activism and solidarity, I think.
Do you believe the Irish Republican cause was a religious cause or a national liberation cause? Where do you frame the united struggle for a united Ireland? Where do you put that?
It's
for yourself.
To my mind anyway, it's a national liberation and it's anti-colonial in nature. And I feel like people better than myself have done a lot of research on this. There was a real kind of movement in the British media at the height of the Troubles to try and frame it like it's a Protestant and Catholic thing. It really isn't. You know, it's that the struggle is anti-colonial in the same way that Algeria's struggle against the French was anti-colonial. Any anti-colonial struggle is. Like, Protestants were killed by Catholics, of course, and vice versa. And I'm sure some religious hatred kind of ended up in that scenario, but by its foundation, I mean, like, I often use the example, Palestinians right now could no more give a damn what religion their colonial oppressors are. It's about the fact that they're taking over their land and they're dehumanizing them and they're trying to eradicate their history and culture and way of life. It's the exact same thing in Ireland. I mean, the Troubles was hopefully the last installation, and it isn't complete yet because we aren't united yet, but it was the last installation of that 800-year struggle. And I don't think people throughout history ever kind of got up and said, I'm going to fight back against these lads, not because they've taken my house and they've raped my sister and whatnot, because they're Protestant, was neither here nor there. Like, we wouldn't have welcomed our British colonial masters anymore if they were Hindu. You know, so, and I think the British kind of tend to do that because they don't want to frame things in Ireland as anti-colonial. They'd rather reduce it to some sectarian spat. It's another way of kind of demeaning and dehumanizing Irish people, I think.
How present or mainstream is a spectrum of anti-British sentiments or attitudes amongst the Irish people? I mean, I know we need data to quantify that properly, but from your observation, from your experience, from your people, Do you think that's people have moved away from that now?
It's tiny. It's really tiny. I mean, like, I would be a big critic of colonialism. I would be definitely a critic of the British state. But to be anti-British, like, I mean, that means that you're anti-British people. And I mean, like, if I'm not that way, and if every single member of Sinn Féin I've ever met, which would have obviously been the traditional Republican party, none of them are anti-British. And again, this is a thing of, you know, there's so many comparisons between the way the British operated and the way the Zionists operate. I'd be here all day. Like, there's definitely a good book in it. But that's another thing that the British nationalists do. They say, like, if you criticise the British state, or you criticise empire, you criticise Churchill, you hate Brits.
Very common argument.
Yeah, like, I've got family members who are British. You know, like, I adore British culture and comedy. Grew up watching British comedy. It's too reductive, and it sidesteps the actual argument. So what they're trying to do is stop you from talking about the effects of colonialism. Like, Britain has an awful lot of reckoning to do with its colonial past. If it did it, in my humble opinion, it wouldn't have voted for Brexit. Part of the Brexit vote was an anti-immigration vote.
Was indeed.
And it was an empire nostalgia vote. It was like, we want our country back. We want Churchill to be back, effectively. We'd like to exhume him and make him the head of state again. And we will rule the world, rule Britannia. It's all fantasy stuff. Like, the world has moved on. Britain is not that country anymore. It doesn't have that level of control. And I think if it had come to terms with the horrors of its imperial past, like the famines in India, like what it did in Ireland, like what it did, I mean, name a conflict in the world, and Britain has probably played some role in it, then I don't think it would have been as nostalgic. To ask Britain to confront its colonial past is not the same thing whatsoever as saying, I hate Brits, I don't hate Brits in a million years. And it's what Zionists do, isn't it? No, they say, you just hate Jews.
I'm so glad that you articulated that so well, Tadhg, because sometimes, yeah, bro, I find that a white person can make that very point in such an articulate way that you have done, and it's palatable to most audiences. But a person of colour or a Muslim would say the same thing. And we could be third, fourth generation, born here, been here for 60, 70 years. And for us to dare raise the question about Britain's accountability or acknowledgement of its colonial past, which has ramifications still today, the very structures, the very setups that we have in many parts of the world and Commonwealth nations, is the ongoing legacy of British colonialism. Now, if I were to say that, immediately I'm seen as someone who's ungrateful, disloyal, fifth column, right? And all I'm basically saying is that, hey, hold on here. We're not talking about empire from thousands of years ago. We're talking in the last 100 to 150 years.
Yeah.
In our living memory for some of our grandparents and great-grandparents, ramifications of which has shaped the world that we live in today, which arguably put the economic great into Britain. For me to merely raise that, you're then, you know, presented as someone who's against the country, you hate the country, you freaking should be done for treachery and treason. And I find it bonkers. But you can say that and you'd be like, hey, man, you know.
Well, I'm sure you'd be, from my understanding of the way X works, I'm sure you'd be told to go home.
Yes.
Like,
deport.
Deport. Even though, like, presumably you were born here and, you know. But I think, again, though, that speaks to the kind of the British nationalism, empire nostalgia. It's the colour of that nostalgic reverie is white. You know, it's back in the era where black and brown people didn't have control. They didn't you know, lead the country. They didn't rise in the ranks. And I'm not a big Rishi Sunak fan, but, you know, that's part of an aspiration that they obviously don't like, because they want to get back to when they went and dominated black and brown countries rather than when black and brown people followed them home, as Tommy Tiernan says.
What would you say to many nationalists, right? And I've engaged quite a few recently who say that, look, this is just white guilt. This is nonsense, because at the end of the day, the Arabs had empires, the Muslims had empires, the Chinese had empires, everyone had empires. Everyone engaged in slavery through the procurement of war and other realities of their time respectively. Why the hell do Brits or Europeans are always held to this standard of being made to feel guilty about their imperialistic past when no one bats an eyelid about any other empire of the past? That is a genuine argument.
Of course, I hear that all the time, yeah.
So what would you say?
So to go back to the comparison with Zionists, we hear the biggest pushback I get when I'm posting pro-Palestine stuff online is, where were you for the other genocides? Why don't you leave our genocide alone? Is effectively what they're saying. I didn't hear you saying anything about Syria. I didn't hear you, and I did. But anyway.
And there was lots happening about those countries.
Of
They
course.
lied. There was things happening about the Rohingya, Syria, Kashmir.
Yeah.
Also, it's just that Palestine is unique because of the literal hand of our governments historically
Exactly.
and currently in the ongoing crimes of the Zionist entity.
And through the fault of these IOF soldiers who are documenting their war crimes, we're watching what they're doing,
Literally.
live streaming.
Yeah.
So if you don't expect us to, but that argument really, when you strip it back, is
White guilt.
leave us alone.
Yeah.
You know, we're doing our genocide over in this corner, and you're only looking at it because you hate Jews. Like, it's a reductive, illogical argument. And I think the Britnat, which I'd call affectionately Britnat's argument about, you know, why you'd sew down chips on our colonialism. There's always been colonialism. There's always been. But we're talking about Britain right now. Like, it's not to say that I would have an issue with, you know, colonialism across the board. The fact of the matter is, though, that Britain, I think, and I'm not here to speak to Britain, I'm just an Irish Republican on a jolly to London for the day. But the fact is, Britain, to me, is repeating the same mistakes, and its society is completely divided. It feels like the racial issue in Britain has never been more tense. So the fact that you're not acknowledging, or sorry, not you're not, but the fact that Britain isn't acknowledging its past means that it's condemned to repeat all those mistakes. So rather than pushing back, I think, which is what they always do and say, hey, why don't you talk about this other colonialism? Arabs did it too, which again is completely racist, and it's thinking it's like the people I hate did it too, so why don't you look at them? Instead of pushing back, if they had the conversation, they might come to terms, I think, with the legacy of colonialism and at least understand why there are these tensions and why a lot of people who are of colour in Britain feel ashamed. And I don't think they feel ashamed to be British. They don't feel ashamed of Britain. I think, and like probably it's arrogant of me to speak for people in this regard, but I do get the sense from them that they're ashamed at the lack of acknowledging it. I speak to some people in France, for instance, and my own armchair understanding of colonialism there is the Brits are kind of almost proud. They're almost like, we don't want to talk about it. We did an awful lot. We ended slavery. We built roads. And to be fair, we didn't take them back when we left.
Built roads, made trains, gave you medicine, gave you technology, shut up, put up.
Absolutely, yeah. Like, you know, and we just made the road, we just made the railways for you as well. Like, it wasn't to extract wealth from your country, but you should be happy with that. Rule Britannia. The French are almost worse, actually, I think, because they just don't want to talk about it at all. It's almost like a kind of a national gaslighting. So, again, in that example, the same racial tensions come up, they come bubbling up, and no one's talking about it. Like, it's like that national consensus that we're not going to talk about it, and all these people who are causing problems, if they are of colour, we'll just criminalise them. And I'm not saying we can be so reductive to say that somebody who's acting out and they're of colour and they commit a crime,
it's because of colonialism.
I'm not saying it's because of colonialism.
We're not saying that.
But the fact that we're not having the conversation is a huge contributing factor, I think.
I agree with much of what you said, and I'd add this perhaps. There is no point Muslims talking about the loss of Spain 800 years ago because it hasn't shaped anything right now in 2024.
Exactly.
Right? There is no point really talking about the 7th or 8th century Islamic expansion of the Umayyads or the Abbasids, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not shaped the modern world that we live in today. But Pax Britannica, European colonialism, Sykes-Picot, these are all things, like I said, is within 100 years.
Absolutely.
It's within the lifetime of our grandparents and our great-grandparents, some of them that are still alive. Like Lord Rothschild just passed away. This man was talking about the letter that was done by, what's the British diplomat who signed the bloody famous statement?
Balfour.
Balfour, yeah. So the letter that Lord Balfour wrote to Lord Rothschild, he was alive. He just died recently. So a lot of these people,
yes,
they can remember this, right? And it has shaped the world that we live in today. Hence why it is a relevant reality.
And even bring it up to the present day. So the legacy of British imperialism is still an issue in the north of Ireland. Within our living memory, they invaded Iraq.
Yes.
They're part of the Afghanistan story, a big part, so just because they've become America's kind of lapdog in the current era,
100%.
They're still doing colonialism, so it's not like it's a distant thing at all, like.
Yeah, and I also think that, to talk about, well, we had the transatlantic slavery, but we also abolished slavery. Well, the legacy of slavery in North America is very much still present there.
Of course.
The institutional racism that's very much embedded within the American jail, prison system and so forth, and criminal justice system, it's very much the modern legacy of, you know, slavery and how it was when slavery was legal, right? But to talk about Arab slave trade from the 10th century, 11th century, which slavery at the time was a norm, and it was an international norm, it was from a procurement and reality of war.
Yeah.
It would happen. F about and find out. If you're not going to wave the white flag and give us your city, we're coming there. Everyone's getting killed and enslaved. It was just the way it was. And I just find that we're talking about it now because it's relevant now.
Yeah. And it's funny because the Britnats say...
It's relevant now.
You have to contextualise the slave trade. So they're happy to contextualise the one they were involved in, but they'll go all the way back to the Arab one
and not contextualise that.
Contextualising.
Yeah, so I do find that a tad disingenuous from their part.
Of course.
But look, you know, I'm liking it because the conversation's organically moving in between the structure that I had. I like it. Let's just wrap up on comedy. Do you have any red lines in your comedy and your sketches? Because there are those who are absolutists amongst the kind of the comedian sector, and that is that, look, everything's up to be satirized. Everything. Religion, God, history, trauma, genocide, race, sexuality, everything's up for a laugh and banter. Where do you fall within that? Do you have any red lines when it comes to sketches and comedy?
Like, I try not to, what I would describe as punch down. So if it's a minority group, they could probably do without me creating jokes about them. So there's nothing, I suppose I'm just attracted to punching up. So like the Irish government, the British government, the US empire, these things attract me because they're massive. Well, in the case of the Irish government, not so big, but to me they're big, I suppose. They resemble authority and the structures that I would like to change. So satire, to me, good satire is always speaking truth to power, and it's punching up, it's fighting against the machine, whatever that machine is. I'm not as attracted as kind of making jokes about ethnic minorities. It's not where my heart is. So on a personal level, my own red lines, I suppose, would be if I feel like I'm sending something up and it's kind of targeting a minority group, that would be a red line for me. And it's just personal. I'm not out there to judge other people in what they do in comedy. I don't believe in this kind of thing that you get. I heard Jerry Seinfeld, who's just the disappointment of my life, speaking about this recently, where, you know, you can't do jokes anymore. It's all gone so woke, and you know, you can't. Like, first of all, Jerry Seinfeld is one of the safest comedians I think the world has ever seen. And second of all, it's a myth that nobody's stopping you from doing these jokes. Like, there's a real fringe element, I suppose, that people are thinking about when they're talking about the woke thing. And it's not, that kind of performative politics is not something I'm interested in anyway. I'm a leftist, and in left-leaning comedy, we're taking the piss out of everything. And again, context is key. Once you're not doing it in a way where you're trying to really destroy or really damage or hurt a minority group, I think you go away for slate. So I don't really think in terms of satire. First of all, satire needs to be in around the red line, because for satire to be effective, it has to be provocative. Like Jonathan Swift's An Honest Proposal is a good example, where the idea of eating children is unbelievably shocking for the time. But that analogy needs to be there in order to send up the establishment class at the time to say, you know, these people might actually be open to this idea. They have so much contempt for the poor. So, you know, Chris Morris would be one of my comedy heroes. Like, his comedy is by its very nature provocative. So the red line thing, when you're speaking truth to power, I'm not so worried about. When you're targeting immigrants or minorities in any description, I don't like that. But I wouldn't be judgmental about it. You know what I mean? Let people do. I have to speak from the personal here. Like, again, context is key. If I see you doing a set and you're taking the piss out of Ireland, no problem. You're my brother. You know,
if Tommy Robinson did it,
fisticuffs. Well, you see, I know it's coming from a different place with him. It's coming from a place of looking down on Irish, and
well, he's been commenting a lot on Ireland. He does come from Irish heritage.
He does, yeah, but he's about as Irish now as the Irish Americans who we were speaking about earlier.
Okay.
But I think his perspective, and I could be wrong, but I'm definitely right, his perspective is coming from that perspective of Ireland being a kind of an inferior, almost ethnically inferior, you know, and this is to go back to where we were saying the connection between Ireland and Palestine. We've gone through all the dehumanization, like treating us like apes, and, you know, we were the ethnic minority in that part of the world in that period, in that colonial period, and arguably still are in a way. So I'm not hearing it from Tommy Robinson, no, but I'm happy for you to do a set on us.
I think it's important. I think it's also important to understand that historical reality was that, you know, when Europe was going through, you know, these huge changes during the Enlightenment and even the Christian Reformation before that, the whole kind of freedom to speak freely, or the freedom of press and the freedom of speech, these things foundationally was to empower the impoverished and the discriminated, the poor, the voiceless, and to hold power to account.
Yes.
So the actual founding principles were very noble and laudable. So even when you hear that, oh, whether Islam's dehumanized, or if Boris Johnson says that women wearing the burqas, like, you know, like a post box. Oh, I did it under free speech. You know, I made a joke about the Iraq war. Oh, it's free speech.
Yes.
Yeah, I get that. But the point of the matter is that historically, foundationally, free speech was always used not against the discriminated, the oppressed,
exactly,
the downtrodden.
That's such a good point.
People who are already being smashed in society, because Europe came to that realization when it chose to have this to speak to power.
Yes.
Whether it was Rome, whether it was the, you know, Catholicism, whether it was whatever oppressive institution it was of the day, it was never to smash the poor, smash the oppressed, mock them, belittle, make their time harder than it already is.
And what's interesting about that, do you know what I mean? It's like, what would be the point in doing that? Like, they've already had enough. So there's, aside from the fact that I think it's arguably morally questionable, in terms of comedy material, it's not interesting. Like, if you look at Zionism at the moment, obviously I'm obsessed, but Zionism is absolutely screaming at me to write satire about it.
Have you ever watched a Zionist stand-up? I never have.
They're not funny.
Okay.
Have
you ever watched it?
I've seen some Zionist sketches that are just like, they're just angry, like mad. But I think it's a mental illness. I think Zionism is a psychosis. I think people will look back in history and go, it's a mass psychosis. That's what it feels like to me. Actually, to go back to Daniel Mate, who's Jewish background, he made a really interesting point. He was kind of saying that the Zionists are not funny because traditionally Jews have always found themselves as the oppressed. Like, that's why, like, traditionally Jews and Irish have got on very well, like, because we come from that position of being, like, you know, displaced and oppressed and dehumanized and whatnot. And you get really rich comedy coming out of that. I mean, most of the best comedians I can think of, in, for instance, in American culture, they're often Jewish. The Zionists are now in this position of kind of control and they've become the thing that they would have always sent up.
They've become the oppressor.
They've become the oppressor, yeah, and so they're not funny. Like, it's an extraordinary thing. Even the crap I get online, you know, sometimes with the British nationalists, the abuse I get, you'd kind of go, fair enough, that's quite funny, you know. I never have a reply from a Zionist that's even trying to be funny. It's always just raw anger, hatred. You know, they've developed this kind of siege mentality where it's just like hate.
What do you think of these IDF sketches they've been doing on TikTok? Have you been seeing them?
They look mentally ill. They like to think that you're on trial for suspected genocide at the moment. The world hates you. Like, I mean, I'm reading in Harrods all the time. Like, they're cottoning on. They know 100%. That they know the war, certainly in terms of the optics of this war, the cultural war, whatever way you want to look at it,
has been like none other before.
It's lost. Yeah. Like I mean, because the world is so deranged and the West's fidelity to Israel is so intrinsic, I'm not sure if it will be damning for them. But certainly in this moment, the ordinary person on the street, not just in Arab countries, like in Ireland, like the absolute hatred for Zionism now, not Jews, and I always have to just say that because, you know, it's their trump card and you got to just be careful about it. But Zionism, people will detest everything that it stands for right now. So for them to make videos of people that they've probably murdered with them wearing their dresses
and underwear and lingerie,
it's a psychosis, man. I've never seen anything like it, to be honest with you. And I'm speaking to people who are like twice my age and who are interested in war and whatnot. Nobody's seen anything like this. It has to come from Ilan Pappé, Israeli historian has made a great point in this, that if you've been brought up, I mean, he saw what was going on in the school system and he's like, this is going to lead to genocide, all out genocide. If you've been brought up to dehumanize Arabs and to feel like they're lesser than you, the logical conclusion of that is those TikTok videos, I think, where it's like somehow in their brain they think it's okay to do what they're doing and to flaunt it. It's harrowing.
Has there been an expectation from you to do more content in the last 7 months, 8 months?
Do you know,
have you felt bad when you've not done enough, or like has there been an increase in output?
There has. I suppose I often would have made a sketch a week or a sketch every 2 weeks. I'm probably making they're more high quality, I suppose. Definitely the rate of stuff that I'm doing has gone up, but that's because I've got people in my corner saying you should do something about this. You should, like, people send me sketch ideas. I made the mistake one time in a live Q&A on Patreon to say I'd like some ideas, and it's just like endless ideas, but a lot of them are actually very good. But look, there's an expectancy a little bit, but I also feel, to go back to what we were saying originally, I feel like we're a tribe. I like the idea of specialization, you know, like Plato had this idea of specialization. I'm a joker. I'm not very good with my fists. I'm not going to go and fight Zionists on the street, but I fight them with my words, and my words are satirical, and comedy is my tool. So I very much feel like I'm part of something much bigger than myself, and I'm playing my little part. So I also feel honoured. I feel absolutely honoured to be compos mentis in this period, to be off the drink and to be way past that period of my life, and again to feel useful, to feel like there's utility to what I'm doing. It's a lovely feeling. But funny, I don't feel under pressure from Palestinians though. The extraordinary nature of my Palestinian friends is, one of them said to me recently, you're doing a lot at the moment, you need to mind your mental health, you need to take it easy. Like a Palestinian saying that at the moment. The only crap I ever get is from white people. So I get Irish Americans sometimes saying, why haven't you shared my fundraiser that's going on in Chicago? Do you think you're too big for your boots now? It's always white people, because we're just, and I don't care if people see this as white guilt, we're just built in to be entitled. You know, like, you've come up with this fundraiser now in Chicago and you have to get an answer from me today. Whereas there's people who are fundraising to get their families out of Gaza at the moment that are not hassling at all. You know, it's extraordinary, yeah. So Irish Americans, white Irish Americans, are the only people who are kind of at me.
Look, I mean, we're kind of moving towards the concluding subject of today's podcast, and that is what appears to be, at least on X and social media, a growing nationalist sentiment, anti-immigration sentiments in Ireland. But before we get to that, and it is linked, one of the claims that I've had from nationalists, whether they're ethno-nationalists or Christian nationalists, is that, look, this kind of white guilt tripping, or like this perpetual kind of habit of blaming white people for everything bad, is actually a ploy of the left to basically create this multicultural utopian shithole where there is nothing of culture, heritage, traditionalism, originality, history left. And this is what they're doing. And one of the ways in which they do this is by perpetually blaming white people for racism, for supremacism, for institutional this, for structural this. And this is all basically just to beat down the white man for crimes that neither he committed, but his forefathers did. What's your views on that?
I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that if you have confronted the effect that European colonialism, it's not so much about race, really, for me. It's about the European colonialists. Most of them tended to be white, that's for sure. If you come to terms with the effects that that has had on the world, you will understand so much more about the way the world works. You will understand climate change an awful lot better. You will understand why the global north is pushing back so much about its need to reform, because it has committed 10% of the damage to the ozone layer. Do you know what I mean? Even not just using that as an example. It's not about like hammering the white man. It's about confronting history, because if you don't understand or confront history, you're condemned to repeat it. And I think the nationalists of any colour or white, of any creed in any country, are so quick to push it back again they've missed the opportunity to actually confront it. Like, most people I know are not calling to white people's houses saying, look at all the damage you've done. It's not about that. That's a hysterical kind of understanding of people who are definitely fringe. It's more like coming to terms with the history itself and saying, like, for instance, in slavery, I know, for instance, like that a lot of black people had slaves as well and engaged in the slave trade. The history is...
Maybe the slave owners and slave sellers were black.
Exactly.
At least in Africa, yes.
Yeah. That's not to say that, like, we then forget about the white person's massive, and particularly the British role in making that the massive success and the horror that it was. But it comes back to that idea of, are we making people guilty, or are we actually confronting history and then learning about the way the world works now? I think it's the latter. And I think, you know, the white guilt thing is just another means of shutting down the conversation. The scholars there's one in particular now whose name escapes me at the moment, but, you know, he often says the means of shutting down the conversation has become the way in which you engage with people on the right a lot of the time. So rather than have the conversation, it's like, the Arabs did it too, you're just making us feel guilty for being white, you're affecting all our mental health. Jordan Peterson, you know? So, like, I kind of feel like that's the foundational thing. But I'll say something else, actually. I'm really, really glad that you differentiated between ethno-nationalism and nationalism. So I'm a nationalist. I'm very proud to be from Ireland.
So I'm just going to ask you, can you be a Republican and a nationalist in the case of the Irish?
You can, because the nationalists, the so-called nationalists, who, by the way, are a very small group in Ireland that I would call ethno-nationalists. They're usually Christian, or they have Christian iconography on their Twitter profiles, and they're usually adherents to the Great Replacement theory, and obviously debunked and wildly racist theory. They've adopted that. Those people would describe themselves as nationalists. They're ethno-nationalists, in my opinion. They're not anti-colonial nationalists. So, for instance, if you're waving the Palestine flag at the moment, that's nationalism. But it's a flag of resistance. It's a flag about the colonial struggle. It's not the same thing as somebody marching down the street waving a British flag, because that has completely different connotations. So I feel like some of the successful colonialists in Europe, namely France, Germany and Britain and others, and the Netherlands, they try to make nationalism now a dirty word, because they're like, oh, look, we did the nationalism thing, now we're moving on from it. And it's just their right-wing parties that want to keep the flags. But how dare they reduce the anti-colonial countries of the world that were oppressed to say that their nationalism is no longer a thing either. Like, I'm very proud to fly the Irish flag because it's a flag of resistance, the same as the Palestinian flag. So the ethno-nationalists, they'll fly the Irish flag too, but they're doing it in a different way. They're commandeering that flag to try and make it about Christian nationalism and white supremacy. It's a fringe thing. It's quite new to Ireland.
Is it fringe? Because in Twitter, it seems to be amplifying. You know, we had the Newtown, Mount Kennedy and County Wicklow protests. This was happening quite recently, whereby there was some information and news of migrants arriving. I think they did arrive there, around 60 of them. They were housed in a hotel nearby. There was a video of a Irish ethno-nationalist representative giving a builder or a contractor a hard time, and they were saying that you shouldn't be doing this.
Yes,
you know?
I saw it, yeah.
And there were some protests. Is it a growing thing, or is it as fringe as you say?
Look, it is growing. That's a fact, right? So I think we were talking off camera that, like, I would be proud to say that Irish ethno-nationalist parties have no political sway whatsoever up until this point. Up until right now, they've never held anything. They're about 0% in the polls for traditionally.
Okay.
So in terms of representation, no. It is growing. And again, to go back to my buddy Tony Groves, the Echo Chamber podcast, I was just talking to him this morning, and he was kind of saying, you know, there's probably three things at play. The media has been complicit and docile, asleep at the wheel for sure, because it has been fomenting the kind of culture war stuff that you get in Britain. Really just adopted a lot of the Tory kind of talking points, and that makes for easy radio and journalism. You know, the things that are going to trigger all the
migration,
exactly, yeah,
all of that kind of
LGBTQ,
stuff.
that'll go in as well, with the kind of ethno-nationalists are fond of that topic as well, right? So that's going on. A lot of them have become client journalists as well. They're writing biographies of Tadhg, and they're not really doing their job anymore. So journalism as a thing in Ireland is really definitely struggling for actual journalists doing their job. There's a lot of client journalism, there's a lot of lazy journalism, and they're deliberately fomenting that. You've got like one of our TV channels are doing shows on the rise of the far right. So I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit from the media's perspective.
But do you think the Irish media is doing that because it makes for easy and, not clickbait, but makes for easy and popular viewing and consumption? Or is it a case that they too ideologically could be shifting?
I think it's the easy route. Like, okay. I often think with Irish media, like where you might suspect ideology, it can often just be like an abdication of responsibility.
Fair enough. Okay,
you know?
Fair enough.
That's my view anyway. There's also been a new element as well, which is that the far right, and again, I'd be reluctant to call some of them far right. So you've definitely got some ethno-nationalists. Then you've got a load of disillusioned kids, you know? So there's 2 points there. One, the Irish government...
Because a fair amount of people did come out.
They did, but it's the kind of same, and Tony was saying, it's the same hardcore.
And then there was riots a good couple of months ago as well.
Yes.
That was also linked to someone being stabbed.
Yes.
Was an Irish lady, her child was stabbed by someone of immigrant
That's
descent.
Right, yeah.
And there was a protest, and there was fights with the clashes with the police, the Garda.
Yeah. You've got a small amount of people who are sending kids out to do their bidding. That's my take on it. Not all the kids who rioted that night, I would say very few of the kids would even describe themselves or even would possibly know what it would be to be a rightist in terms of their political ideology. They're kids that are living in communities in Ireland that have been completely abandoned and not served properly by successive governments. We've got like a tradition in Ireland of kind of centrist, centre-right, corporatist governments that are beholden to US multinationals.
So those sentiments and grievances would then be justified and genuine and legitimate of those people?
100%. 100%. And I think it's a lapse in the left. The left should have been, leftist parties should have been addressing the issues in those communities, and they should have been able to
Why haven't they?
Well, we haven't had a leftist government in Ireland before, so they haven't had the power to do it. I mean, in their local communities, they're doing well, but the government has failed to provide services to these areas, particularly in poor inner city areas in Dublin and Cork and whatnot. And then these kids, I think during COVID was a big thing where they became kind of radicalised online, and opportunists are making them feel like the problem actually is not the government so much, the problem is immigrants. And that's a tale as old as time itself, that it's like immigrants come in, actually blame the immigrants. It's not these people who've been in government for 12 years.
Well. I mean, from what I've seen, they are blaming the government.
They are, but actually most of their vitriol is against Sinn Féin. And Sinn Féin have never been in power in the South. You know, so it's interesting. They feel like Sinn Féin have ideologically let them down. That's why they're trying to position themselves as nationalist party. Sinn Féin used to present themselves as the nationalist party. Now they've let down these ethno-nationalists because they feel like Sinn Féin are too open to immigration and those other issues.
Too lefty.
Too lefty, exactly. But the other thing though, the other element, and by the way, I have a lot of sympathy for these kids. I don't have any sympathy for the people at the puppet masters who are deliberately doing it. They're making money off it. They're grifting and they're fomenting, be it inside and outside of the media. But for the kids, I grew up in an area that didn't have a lot of services as well. Like, you'd need somebody to put the arm around you socially and politically to make sure that you don't end up going down this anti-immigration route. But we have certainly, there's been the far right in Britain particularly, and also the US, are certainly supporting this rise in ethno-nationalism. I think financially and in terms of talking points, I know Tommy Robinson is very involved.
Very vocal, perhaps one of the most vocal commentators on the events in Ireland.
This creates, like, you've got ex-British Army running as independent candidates in this ultra far right Irish Nationalist Party. Like, it's an absolute basket case of a concept. You would imagine Irish nationalists, traditionally, their most fevered opponent would be the Brits. Yeah. And yet, like, Tommy Robinson is welcomed over. So there's marriages of convenience all over the place. So I think, like, it needs to be challenged because ideologically it's very, very weak, and it's very it can be pulled asunder very easily. But we certainly need to stand up to it. People who would have been treated as jokes online are now running for European elections. So they've got money. Where's the money come from? I would imagine, from elements in Britain and the US. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. If I post something pro-immigration or pro-Palestine, I will often get abuse online from people. One person, like this guy recently called me a libtard. Now, no one in Ireland, in the history of Ireland, has ever used that term.
Uses that language.
Yeah. So we know straight away that's and if you look into these accounts, they're all American accounts. Their talking points are American, and I think some of their money is certainly American. So they're nefarious hands in the good old colonial countries that are trying to spread this stuff in Ireland. And we definitely need to stand up to it as a country, but it's not as big as you would imagine from videos on Twitter at the moment.
We're concluding comments, bringing the podcast to a close. How do you then address genuine concerns and grievances towards those things that you've just mentioned? You know, lack of housing, a lack of access to social funds, general regeneration of certain areas that are struggling socioeconomically, deprivation, all of that stuff, youth delinquency, those areas which are genuinely struggling, right? And to add to that as well, when they see that someone of African descent or someone of immigrant descent does come over, lives in a hotel, is put up there, given 3 meals a day, all covered by the taxpayer. What would your concluding comments be to your countrymen who have these genuine concerns and grievances about these issues? What would you say to them, and for them to then opt ethno-nationalism as an outlet for that?
I would say they are understandable grievances that they have about the way that Ireland works. I share them. I would share an awful lot of the grievances of young, disaffected men and women in Ireland who feel like they've been frozen out of the so-called success story of Ireland. We've got like one of the highest GDPs in the world, and yet ordinary people are poor. Even our middle class are poor. There's just an elite group in Ireland that have been looked after successively by governments over the last, really since the foundation of the state, with the exception of periods where Fianna Fáil were good for ordinary people. But certainly when Fine Gael are in power in the last 12 years, it's really been a boys' club in terms of anybody that gets kickback from the so-called wealth of the country. We're supposedly a rich country, and by God, it doesn't feel like it. We have an absolutely out of control housing crisis. People my age and obviously way younger can give up the dream of ever owning a house in Ireland. People are leaving Ireland to pursue job opportunities elsewhere again in the kind of ways that they did in the 80s. We've a health service that's completely on its last legs. So I understand those grievances. Immigrants have not created those problems. And one thing is for sure, the current government are licking their lips at this culture war stuff. As long as people are looking at the so-called far right, which really is just a handful of people, it's mostly disaffected people who I totally identify with. As long as we're looking over there, we're not looking at the failings of this government. And I think what I would say to people who are leaning to that kind of ethno-nationalist route, the immigrant has never been your problem. The ruling class in Ireland we've always had a kind of a partition, and I'm not talking about North and South, in Southern Ireland between the ruling class, the elitists, who kind of spring originally from the British aristocracy, actually, and poor people. We've always had that. And it wasn't the fault of immigrants for however many years, and it's not the fault of immigrants now. Do we need to consult with towns and communities that don't have the services when immigrants are coming in there? Of course, that's another failing of government. But as long as people are looking over there at the immigrant and looking at the far right story, they're not looking at how do we change this government and get a government in there that works for all of us and works to look at those deprived areas. We've had some success over the past. It's now a massive problem, particularly in inner city Dublin. So I would say to those people, join us. We have the same grievances. But you need to be able to stick out your hand in friendship to somebody who is your brother. We have more in common with immigrants coming from war-torn countries than we do with the people who are funding your ethno-nationalist campaign. We have so much more in common with people from Afghanistan and Palestine and Egypt than we do with British nationalists and American nationalists. So let the hate go and let's build a better Ireland together.
What's coming up for you in the coming months this year? Anything happening? Anything interesting? Going anywhere? Doing anything?
I am going to Iran.
Wow.
I've been invited to a film festival in Iran. I'm going to do some workshops over there. I am possibly going to Egypt if I can pull it off to try and get as close to the border with Rafah as I can.
Okay.
I am doing I've got a one-man show called Gatman, which I'll be doing in Dublin, and I'll be touring. But other than that, I'm making the work consistently, and I've lost all my corporate work. My opportunities are definitely dwindling in terms of TV opportunities because of my stance. So Patreon is my big thing now. So if people want to check me out on Patreon, I kind of do extra stuff on there, and people have been very generous to me. I've been able to survive in the last few months, even though I've lost, like, I don't know how much corporate work, because, as you know, being anti-genocide is bad for business.
Absolutely. Tadhg, it was an absolute pleasure having you on.
I could have chatted to you all day, brother.
Likewise. I thoroughly enjoyed today's conversation. I look forward to having you on again in the near future.
I'd absolutely love it.
Thank you, Tadhg.
Thank you.
Brothers and sisters and friends, I hope you all thoroughly enjoyed today's podcast as much as I did. If you are watching via YouTube, do remember to click subscribe. And of course, for the avid podcast listeners, you can find this episode on all 3 seasons on all the major audio platforms. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.